Welcome, and thank you for joining today's 2020 NVAP orientation. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Note that all audio connections are muted at this time. To submit a question, you can select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and send. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer using WebEx. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Liz Fernandez. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez, and I work with the Professional Services Development Branch with USDA APHIS Veterinary Services. I'd also like to welcome you to today's webinar. Just a quick message. If you have not been able to sign into the WebEx link with your email address, you will not get credit for today's webinar because we have to have you signed into the link. We know we have a lot of people on the call number, but we don't seem to have people signed on to the WebEx itself. So to continue, we have 3 speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Rick Tanner. Prior to being selected as the area veterinarian in charge for Kansas, Dr. Tanner served as assistant veterinarian in charge for Veterinary Export Trade Services Service Center in Sacramento and was stationed in Topeka, Kansas. Prior to joining USDA Vet Services in 2011, Dr. Tanner was a practicing veterinarian in a rural mixed animal practice for 20 years. He is a 1991 graduate of Kansas State University College of Veterinary Medicine, and his family raised Red Angus seed stock on their ranch north of Topeka, Kansas. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Brad Christensen. Dr. Christensen is a field epidemiology officer for APHIS Veterinary Services stationed in Topeka, Kansas. He graduated veterinary school at the Colorado State University in 2003 and received a master's in public health through the University of Iowa in 2015. He joined USDA in 2015 after 12 years in private practice. And our third speaker is Dr. Dan Ryder. Dr. Ryder is an emergency coordinator for APHIS Veterinary Services in Topeka, Kansas. Dr. Ryder is a 2007 graduate from Kansas State Vet School and completed an anatomic pathology residence at Washington State University. And with that, I'm going to pass the webinar over to Dr. Tanner.
Thanks, Liz. I want to welcome everybody to the webinar today. And I hope wherever you are, you and your families are safe. These are certainly some strange days, and you all will have an unprecedented spring semester as vet students, that's for sure. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So this slide is a link to the National Veterinary Accreditation Program Reference Guide. It's on our APHIS website. We're going to have several slides at the end of the presentation that will have several useful links that you may find helpful later on, so you don't have to copy these right away. We'll also be talking a little later on, or there'll be a link for it, but usajobs.gov is the website for government jobs, and any of you folks that still may be looking for work, that's the place to go. It'll be on one of the last slides again. It's usajobs.gov. Next slide, please. Okay, so the elements of the orientation program, this is what we're going to talk about today, is the federal animal health laws and regulations. We're going to discuss interstate and international movement of livestock and pets. We'll talk about USDA animal disease eradication and control programs. We'll talk about lab support, and then professional and ethical conduct, standards of conduct for the accredited veterinarian. And then we'll also have a couple sections on foreign animal disease awareness, animal health emergency management. Next slide, please. This is the outline for the webinar today. I'm going to cover Section 1 and 2 on accreditation and animal movement, and then Dr. Christensen is going to cover 3 and 4, disease programs, animal ID, and then there'll probably be a break after Section 4, 10 or 15 minutes, and then Dr. Ryder will take the foreign animal disease sections and some disease scenarios. Next slide. Okay, so what is accreditation? Accreditation is basically government approval for private practitioners to perform work on behalf of the government. And we're going to talk about what you do as an accredited veterinarian throughout the presentation, but it could be program disease testing for things like TB or brucellosis, or some herd accreditations for the CERVID program or SCRAPE program, issuing health certificates, things like that. Authorization is a term used when you're accredited in one state, but you're authorized to do work in another state. So some folks are going to be in maybe some large consultation practices or practices in a city along a state line, and you very well could have clients in more than one state, and you're going to want to be able to service all those clients. So we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the presentation. Next slide. So the regulatory authority that kind of lays down the rules and regulations for accredited veterinarians is in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title IX. It's the part that covers animals and animal products, and Part 161 describes the requirements and application process to become an accredited veterinarian. It describes ethical, professional conduct and responsibilities. There's sections in there about rules for suspension and revocation if you aren't following those guidelines. And then there are some guidelines on penalties for misconduct. This slide also has a link to 9 CFR Parts 160, 161, and 162. These are the parts of the CFR that cover accreditation. Next slide, please. So federal animal regulations that affect accredited vets, this is also part of this CFR. Subchapter B covers the program diseases. Chapter C covers interstate and international movements, or just interstate, and then subchapter D covers international import and export of animals. Next slide, please. Okay, just some definitions. USDA is loaded with acronyms. The AVIC is the area veterinarian in charge. That's the veterinary official employed by APHIS who's assigned to manage and supervise the official work of APHIS in their particular state. Some AVICs have more than one state they take care of. We've got our Kansas area office phone number there. That number will be answered during normal business hours and be forwarded to the AVIC if you have any questions or concerns. VMO, that's a federally employed veterinary medical officer. They're the folks that are out in the field. There's 4 federal veterinary medical officers in Kansas, and we have 3 straight veterinarians in Kansas that cover Kansas. SAHO, or State Animal Health Official, that's the state official who's responsible for livestock and poultry disease control and eradication programs in their state. And in Kansas, it's Dr. Justin Smith. He works for the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and his phone number is there at the end of that section. Next slide. So Kansas Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we work in a partnership. This map shows coverage area for our BMOs and state veterinary medical officers. The federal BMOs, Dr. Garton is in southeast Kansas, Dr. Snyder's in north central, Dr. Elkers is a little further west, and then Dr. Butterfield is in the far northwest. We have state veterinarians, Paul Gross-Didier's in the northeast, John Nelson's south central, and Gerald Gibson's in the southwest part of the state. These are the folks, when you're out as a practicing veterinarian, you're going to want to develop a relationship with. You're going to want to have their phone numbers and your cell phones. They're going to be your first contacts, most likely, in case that, you know, if you've got a question about a suspicious case, wonder if it's a foreign animal disease, wondering if you should have somebody come look. These are the folks you're going to want to get a hold of. And then, of course, if you can't, you're going to want to call the area office, and we'll get somebody out there to help you. While they all have sections, you know, they do cover for each other pretty normally. You know, folks are on vacation or at training. It's not uncommon at all for our folks to help cover for the state people. So just keep that in mind that it's a partnership. We all kind of work together. Next slide, please. Okay, so accreditation is voluntary. If you don't want to do accredited work, and you know, like I said, we talk about health certificates, TB testing, pulling samples for EIA testing. You don't really have to be an accredited veterinarian to just practice medicine. But if you want to do that, you know, we're glad to have you. But if you're not interested in becoming accredited, you probably don't need to complete the webinar. Okay, next slide. Most countries use government veterinarians to do about all the regulatory work. They do, you know, all the TB testing, all the brucellosis testing. They do the brucellosis vaccinations. They do the examinations and issue health certificates. But let's just go to the next slide. In the United States, we've just got too many animals and not enough federal or state veterinarians to accomplish that task. So the United States relies on accredited veterinarians to basically help us maintain our trade status and our health status in the United States to be able to trade freely with their trade partners and to move animals and animal products internationally. Accredited veterinarians, they're acting as agents for the federal government. They test for these program diseases. They issue the health certificates. They're the ones responsible for performing the examinations and making sure the animals have proper identification. They're usually the first one to actually recognize an FAD. A lot of times, or foreign animal disease, a lot of times they're going to be contacted by one of their clients for, you know, suspicious death or suspicious lesions. But the accredited veterinarians, you guys are the first ones to see those, and we want you to be, you know, looking for them. We want you to be, you know, feel free to contact us. No request will be denied if somebody wants one of our folks to come out and investigate. And as a practicing veterinarians being out in the country, you're actually doing surveillance. I mean, you may see a horse come in for, you know, a lameness exam or a Coggins test, and maybe you notice blisters on his coronary band or something. You know, vesicular stomatitis has recently resurged. We've got a case in New Mexico right now, and lesions on the coronary band would be consistent with vesicular stomatitis. So, you know, that may initiate a call from you to your section veterinarian to come help do an FAD on that animal. So you may not realize you're doing surveillance, but you really are. Okay, next slide. So accredited veterinarians, I mean, you develop a lot of relationships. Hopefully you feel comfortable working with USDA and the State Departments of Agriculture. If you're in the livestock industry and you're doing a lot of livestock work, more than likely you're going to have interactions with USDA and the State Department of Animal Health, and we want you all to be comfortable with those interactions. We are always glad to visit and advise in any way we can. Accredited veterinarians, they'll develop relationships with testing labs, whether it's a state lab or NVSL. Depending on the state you're in, maybe a lab that can't run the test you want to run, and you may develop relationships with several labs. And then, of course, your clients in the industry are your backbone of your business. Okay, next slide, please. So accredited veterinarians, I would say by and large, most of the accredited work that accredited veterinarians do is in the livestock sector. Accredited veterinarians do issue health certificates for small animals, but when we think about accredited veterinarians and accredited work, most of it revolves around livestock and issuing international health certificates, following examinations and diagnostic testing. You're responsible for the whole thing. You've got to make sure you're using the right health certificate, pulling the right samples, you know the requirements of the state or the country you're moving to. That's going to be just part of the job. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, this is kind of a repeat, but like I said, accredited veterinarians do the bulk of the work, especially with interstate movement of animals. We'll talk about this in a little while, but the interstate movements are issued on a certificate of veterinary inspection, and the only signature on that of any regulatory authority is the accredited veterinarians. When you move international, export animals internationally, there'll be the accredited veterinarian signature and followed by endorsement by USDA. But interstate, it's all on you. International, you've got the USDA endorsement, but it's only after your work's been checked and double-checked. Accredited veterinarians, this training that you're going through now and your counterparts in other states is going through is kind of trying to make sure you all have a uniform understanding of the accredited duties so the programs are all kind of kept in uniform fashion. Like we talked about, accredited veterinarians are the first line of surveillance for foreign animal disease, and these are just a few pictures. The one on the left there is a rooster with the cyanotic comb and wattles and edematous comb and wattles. That's open mouth breathing like that. That's pretty indicative of high-path avian influenza. The center top picture, those lumps are from lumpy skin disease, and that's the inside of a calf's leg. These pictures aren't very descriptive other than what you can see. The center photo on the bottom there, that's a horse with African horse sickness, and he's got this swollen conjunctiva, and it's kind of injected. So that's a disease that just popped up in Thailand, and it hasn't been diagnosed in Asia for like 30 years and never in Thailand. So these are diseases that can show up in places that you don't expect, and we just want everybody to be aware. Of course, the pig on the right there, he's got a big old vesicle on his snout. That's consistent with foot and mouth disease. So Dr. Wright will talk about these diseases a little more later on in his section, but just want to make you aware. All right, next slide. Okay, as accredited veterinarians, you are acting as government veterinarians. I know every case you see may not involve accredited work, but if you have a relationship with a ranch or farm or dairy or poultry house, you know, when you're there doing accredited work, we expect you to be sanitary and you know, take steps to prevent moving diseases from one farm to another. And I recommend that practice whether you're there for accredited work or not. It just shows goodwill, and with these crazy times we're going through right now, everybody understands the importance of biosecurity and cleanliness, so it's just a good habit to get into. All right, next slide. Okay. I kind of apologize for these slides. Sometimes we're kind of jump from one thing to the next, but we did have to abbreviate the slide set a little bit to get everything into the time we had allotted. But we talked a little bit about health certificates and accredited veterinarians. That's a big part of their job, and it's an important part of their job. And I think that accredited vets should take these very seriously. They should charge accordingly, and you know, there's time involved here. International health certificates, like I talked about earlier, those are all going to be submitted for USDA endorsement at an area office or service center. All those health certificates are double-checked by a federal veterinary medical officer. They're going to look for accuracy of the data. They're going to make sure you have the right certificate. Make sure the right testing was done and all the timing was correct. And if there's an issue, they'll tell you they can't endorse it, and you'll have to, you know, resubmit or correct the certificate that was submitted before. So take this job serious. It can be a real money maker if you charge for your time. Okay, next slide. My next slide. Okay, completion of this program and holding a veterinary license alone does not make you an accredited veterinarian. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So, requirements for accreditation. Of course, you have to complete the initial accreditation training. That was kind of your license to get into this webinar. You should all have that. You need to attend the orientation program. That's what we're doing today. And then after you guys graduate and become licensed in the state you want to practice, you submit application VS Form 136A. That's your application for accreditation. And if it's approved, you'll receive an accreditation letter from me and be co-signed by Dr. Smith. Okay. Next slide. So this, we talked about this a little bit earlier about authorization in additional states. So if you want to do accredited work in another state, you have to get licensed in the other state first. And then you want to talk to the AVIC that oversees the state the second state you want to work in. And some states require state-specific orientation. Nebraska does. I know that for a fact. Kansas does not. But once you make contact, get state-specific orientation done if you need to, you'll receive a written authorization, and then your accreditation will be updated in our database, and it will show you as accredited in both states. But you're not accredited. The only state you're accredited in initially is the state that you make first application to. So very important. It comes up sometimes in export, and we want to make sure you're accredited in every state you want to do work in. Okay, next slide. So species-based accreditation categories. So when you make your application on the 136A, you'll either declare you want to be a Category 1 accredited veterinarian or Category 2 accredited. Category 1 basically limits you to pets and you know, some small exotics, pocket pets, snakes, things like that. But if you want to do any work with birds or livestock, horses, you need to be a Category 2 accredited veterinarian, and Category 2 accredited veterinarians can do all species. Category 1 is limited to small animal. Okay, next slide. So there is a renewal process for accreditation. You have to renew every 3 years. It's a two-step process. You have to complete some supplemental training, and I want to say there's 36 modules you can choose from. They're on the NVAP site that I showed the link to earlier, and will be included at the end, but you can do them web-based. We routinely give these at some of the continuing education meetings, but as you may have heard, the June conference in Kansas City or in Manhattan has been changed to a virtual meeting, and due to that fact, we won't be presenting any modules over there. I mean, if they can get on the internet to go to the meeting, they could probably get on the internet and do the modules themselves and not have to listen to us talk. So, but they're all on there. If you're Category 1 accredited veterinarian, you have to do 3 modules every 3 years. If you're Category 2, you have to take 6 modules. And the modules are really pretty darn good. I talk with a lot of accredited veterinarians, and some of them have been practicing 25 and 30 years, and they say they really enjoy doing them. They say they learn something every time they take them, so it's not a burdensome thing to do, but you will have to update every 3 years and then submit a new Form 136A. Next slide. So this kind of standards of conduct for accredited veterinarians. You know, like I said, you're acting on behalf of the government. All of our programs we take seriously. The interstate movement of animals, the program diseases. You know, when you think about it, we kind of do all of those things to support international trade and to maintain the health of our national herd. And if those things become compromised, our trade's compromised, you know, I think it's in the billions of dollars what our export trade's worth. So we want to really make sure that we take those things serious. So when you're doing accredited work, we want you to issue complete and accurate forms. You know, don't take shortcuts. If other accredited veterinarians in your practice have done some work that may become part of an export health certificate, they need to be indicated on the lab work and on the health certificate, so we know that they're accredited. That's one thing that when accredited work and testing is done for part of an export health certificate, we're going to check to make sure the veterinarian that did the work was accredited. If he's not, then that testing is null and void, and it's got to be redone. Need to do the activities according to the regulation. Personally identifying reactors, that's kind of in the case of brucellosis and TB reactors. You probably won't get too involved with that. Our federal VMOs will probably do most of that. Next slide, please. You want to have you immediately report any regulated diseases, maintain biosecurity. I mean, if you're out investigating a suspected foreign animal disease, we're going to want to make sure that, you know, while you're there, you know, you're kind of maintaining biosecurity. You're keeping people off the premise. You're not traveling from there to the next place. They're kind of common sense things, but they're very serious at the same time. I want you to know know the current regulations. I don't expect you to know every single regulation, but if you're going to go out and do some work, you know, study it up before you go. Make sure you know, if you're going to do a TB injection on a cow, you have to wait 72 hours before you can go back and read it. If you do TB injection on swine, it's 48 hours. And that's a big deal. If that's not done at the right time, it can compromise the health certificate as well. Use your accountable property in accordance with regulations. If you're out TB or brucellosis vaccinating animals, tattooing the ear is part of that. We want to make sure that you're doing the tattooing or you're overseeing the technician doing the tattooing while you're doing the injections. You don't want those tattoo pliers laying around. Maintain security of the tags, forms, certificates. Keep track of your health certificates, your vaccination forms. You don't want those laying where somebody can, forge those forms and send them in and causes problems. Next slide, please. Okay, so, yeah, non-compliance with accredited duties, it's reported. I mean, sometimes it's your peers reporting it. Sometimes it's a disgruntled client or dissatisfied client. They'll report things that they think maybe the accredited veterinarian didn't quite follow the rules. And we'll do some follow-up on that, and if justified, we'll launch an investigation. There's USDA investigation and enforcement services. They'll come out, visit the accredited veterinarian. They'll gather documents, and so, after they're all through with their investigation, they'll formalize a report and present it to the ABIC. And thank goodness this doesn't happen very often, because it's not a pleasant thing. But if you're not doing things the right way, if you're taking shortcuts, if you're doing anything fraudulently, it's a good chance you're going to get caught, and then consequently, we can impose sanctions on you, up to removing your accreditation. There's civil penalties that are out there for real bad actors, and all it's going to do is kind of basically take away your right to make a living for a while. May cost you financially, and it's just not worth it. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of pressure at times to maybe look the other way or do something halfway, but please take this seriously, because it does get reported, it does get investigated, and action is taken on a lot of these cases. So just beware. I think we're done with that section. Let's go to the next slide.
Hey, Rick, before you move on, can I jump in real quick?
Absolutely.
Sorry, folks. I know there is a lot of you that are. I know there are a lot of you that are not able to sign into the webinar, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to respond back to your emails. But thank you for letting me know, so I can at least find out who is having these troubles. I think we only got about half of our folks have been able to sign in. Christian, do you want to say anything, or like provide them a email address or a phone number over the phone line for those folks that are having trouble, or?
Sure. At the moment, I think I've responded to about 30 to 40 individuals that sent me an email, and we're looking into the problem. At first, we thought it's because of the location, or maybe the internet connection is probably just unstable for that location, but it seems like other locations are having troubles as well. I'd say just try connecting again, but we're looking at on the back end as well to see what's going on.
All right. We're going to go ahead and continue moving on. Again, I apologize. I've got copies of emails from you too, so we'll continue to move through this section. Hopefully you can get on, but we'll try to some sort of a resolution at the end if you weren't able to be on the entire webinar. Okay, Rick, I'll let you go ahead. I'm on the title slide for section 2.
Okay, so this section's about animal movement, and like Liz said before I was ABIC, I was in the export part of USDA and dealt with this on a daily basis. So, okay, let's go to the next slide, Brad. Okay, so why should we regulate animal movement? Like I said earlier, we want to stop disease spread. We want to maintain the integrity of the health status of our national herd. Agriculture is, incredibly big business. I think we had over $75 billion in exports in just bovine, poultry, and swine products last year. So it's a big, big deal. We don't want to spread any disease to any country that doesn't have specific diseases. So, I mean, it's regulated. Those countries come up with their requirements on what they want us to validate before we move animals. So we want to make sure any animals we move are healthy. We don't want to, harm them in any way during their movement. It also provides traces of movement in case sometime on down the line we have an outbreak of tuberculosis in a state. We can look at that animal if it came into that state and see who its cohorts were and track back to the herd of origin and hopefully stamp out any disease before it spreads widely. Once again, we really want to protect those export markets and open new and emerging markets. Okay, next slide. So what's your role as accredited veterinarian? We talked about this a little bit before, but we'll maybe take a different angle for small animals. You're going to have folks coming in that want to take their dog to a new state or to a new country. They may be moving for a job or in the service. You're going to be their first contact on how do I move my animal. And so we're going to have some resources here for you to help you, work through those programs. As an accredited veterinarian, most animals, livestock, have to be identified. You're going to be responsible for identifying those animals with official ID. Dr. Christensen will talk about that a little more later. You're going to be responsible for any of the examinations, vaccinations, blood samples, and then eventually you'll be responsible for completing the health certificate or the CBI if it's an interstate certificate. Okay, next slide. So as it relates to interstate movement, the accredited veterinarian kind of has a role as, ensuring that animal is healthy and fit to travel. The accredited veterinarian is also responsible to make sure the animal is bearing any official ID required. If it's something like a horse or a pet, they're going to be your accredited veterinarians responsible for an accurate description of that animal. It's an official document, and basically it's kind of like a passport for that animal to move to the next state or the next country, and we want to have accurate information in case we ever need to know where that animal went or where that animal had been. Accredited veterinarian is going to be responsible for determining the state requirements for the state of destination. Most departments of agriculture have really good websites that outline their state requirements. You can get on there, determine what the animal needs to have done, all the testing that has to be done. If there's ever any questions on interpretation of the website, you can go back to the state of destination, call them up. They'll be happy to discuss what's required for an animal to move into that state. Like I said earlier, basically the interstate movement is kind of a totally responsibility of the accredited veterinarian. Okay, international movements, a little bit different. The health requirements vary from country to country, and a lot of it depends on the disease. If just like the United States, I mean, we don't accept cloven-hoofed animals from countries that have foot and mouth disease. So if say, if a country, is trying to, not import a disease that we have, they're going to put bans on us or restrictions or potentially, require some testing. So it's all about disease protection. Some of it's political, economic factors. If we don't have trade agreements with a lot of countries, a lot of times we can't move animals to those countries. You want to check with the BS district office or the service center for the most current requirements for a country that you may be wanting to ship an animal to. Hopefully we can get that information, and I think the next slide's got some information there. Let's go back. Yeah, so, the office can help you. The last bullet here talks about the international regulations for movement of animals. There's international IREGs and interstate IREGs. Those sites will take you to those specific regulations. If a country doesn't have a listing there, the next thing is to have the importer work with the vet official in the country of destination. And then if we're having troubles, with determining state requirements, it's the same way. It's kind of whoever bought that animal or is moving the animal to the new state would check with that state of destination for requirements. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this goes over a little bit of the international certification process. Like I said, we're talking about moving animals out of the country. So accredited veterinarian does the examinations, test, and completes the health certificate. He's going to have to work with accredited labs to do the testing. There's a website I think Dr. Christensen will talk about that lists all the labs that are approved to conduct specific testing. So you'll have to utilize those labs, and then the lab reports will go to the federal veterinarian, and as well as the health certificate. The federal veterinarian will go over the health certificate and all the testing, make sure everything is in order, and they will endorse the certificate. Now, sometimes this is a point of confusion. The accredited veterinarian signs and issues the health certificate. The federal veterinarian basically is checking to make sure that the accredited work was all done properly, and then he endorses that work. So there's always two veterinarian signatures on international health certificates, the accredited veterinarian signature and a federal veterinarian signature. The only time that doesn't really come into play is pets to Canada and to Mexico. They can move basically on a rabies certificate. In most cases, don't even require a certificate. But that's only dogs and cats. Okay, next slide. We'll talk about certificates for animal movements. USDA endorses certificates for research animals, livestock, pets, working animals. Now, if it's a research animal like a primate, something like that, those are all regulated by CDC, so we don't do that. But just about any other animal, a lot of zoo animals are based on USDA endorsement, along with an accredited veterinarian issuing the health certificate. But it all varies on the country of destination and the species. Okay. Next slide. So regarding sections of the certificate, I'm just going to emphasize once again that when you're doing a health certificate or a test form, just make sure that you complete the whole thing. We don't want blank spaces. If there's a space that is asking for information, if there is no applicable information, just put NA or none, but it needs to be completed. So regarding the certificate, so there's always a consignor. That's the person sending the animal There's typically a consignee, that's the person receiving the animal, and there's always an associated physical address with both places. Kind of goes back to traceability. We want to be able to go, we want somebody to be able to drive right to that spot. Official animal ID and description is always part of the health certificate. Any required tests, vaccinations, or treatments that are listed in the requirements, they have to be indicated on the health certificate. And then typically the health certificate's got statements on it, and it just varies from country to country and state to state. But there will always be a certification statement, generally revolving around fitness to travel, no signs of clinical disease, maybe a special statement if the animal, like for instance now with the vesicular stomatitis in New Mexico, some countries will put in a statement that they want a statement on the certificate that this animal has not been in any state affected with vesicular stomatitis in the last 21 days. And those are just things that we want folks to be aware of, that those statements do change. They change not year to year, but they change periodically. So I would just say that, if you think you're comfortable sending animals or cattle to Canada and you haven't sent one for 2 or 3 years, you better go back and read the regulation and make sure that they haven't made any updates, because those things are updated more often than what you would think. Signatures, always a requirement. More and more states and more countries are accepting digital signatures, but in the case of a requirement for a wet signature, we always recommend using signature in an ink different than the color the certificate was printed in. That just verifies it's not a copy. My recommendation is to print all health certificates in black and white and to sign with blue ink. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So filling out the certificate, once again, make sure you're using the right forms, certs and test forms. Just very recently, the EIA test chart was updated. If you go to a practice and the veterinarian's got some old EIA test forms and you submit those, the lab should not be running that test. They should be sending that form back and telling you to redraw blood and send in a new form. So you got to make sure you're using the appropriate forms. You want to make sure we've got the right health certificate. It kind of goes back to what I said, that those things are updated from time to time. If you're using an outdated certificate, the federal veterinarian is going to return that and ask you to do a new one. Once again, fill it out completely and accurately. Pay attention to the instructions. Certain countries may ask for a particular date format. They may want day, month, year. Some of them want all 4 digits of the year. Some just want 2. So be meticulous and take your time. Include the certification statements, include your lab results when you send in the certificate, and personally sign a correct color. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So regarding the validity of the certificate, most health certificates are good for 30 days. Some of them are less. Small animal certificates to the European Union are 10 days. And you got to watch the timing of your work. Just for instance, a health certificate issued to Canada is good for 30 days for cattle. But there's also a statement on there that says this animal was checked for, tested for brucellosis within the last 30 days. So if you tested that animal 20 days ago and you're in there with the certificate today to get it signed, theoretically that certificate's only good for 10 days because his brucellosis is going to expire in 10. Happens more than you think. I mean, a lot of folks will start, getting animals prepped for export and then have trouble finding trucking. And I signed certificates that were really only good for 2 days. I mean, and the people knew it. We told them, said, look, you got to get up there. This thing's going to expire. So timing of the work is a very important part of the validity of the certificate. Okay, recording who worked on the animal. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Stuff that you personally done. If you did all the testing, you did everything, you don't have to do anything different. If you had another accredited veterinarian that did some of the testing, if perhaps, he did the TB testing, that person you want to make notation on the health certificate that these animals were tested by Dr. So-and-so on this date at this location. I just want to make sure you validate that. Okay. Next slide. So some errors that will invalidate the certificate. Once again, we talked about the wrong form. It'll get sent back to you. If it's not signed, it'll get sent back to you. This goes back a little bit to some of the forms aren't real clear that 2 signatures are required, but just know any health certificate, whether it's interstate or international, you as the accredited veterinarian will have a signature on it. And the international ones, we as federal veterinarians will endorse, and if there isn't a spot for us to sign, we'll find a spot. But you will always sign both interstate and international health certificates. Okay, we talked about outdated information, the testing expired, or perhaps, you're using an old certificate and it's outdated. Improper ID of animals. This comes up sometimes with an EIA test chart. May have a drawing of a horse with 4 white socks, and we get a health certificate with a horse that has 3 white socks. We're gonna determine which one's right and get the right animal on the right certificate. So make sure you're paying attention to IDs. IDs of cattle to Canada. Canada now requires an 840 RFID ear tag. They used to allow the metal calfhood tag or a metal silver bright tag. If it doesn't have an 840 when it gets to Canada, it's not crossing. It'll be sent back. So, and that goes back to a little bit of, when you're out doing this work and you want to put the ID in at the time of the work, but you also want to make sure that your client knows that if that animal loses this ID, it should not be loaded and sent on with the rest of the animals, because without the ID, that animal will be rejected. Sometimes a wrong test is performed, and this goes back to the country of destination will determine which test they want ran. They may not use the most specific test or maybe the best test in our minds, but it's the test they're familiar with and comfortable with. And if you don't use the test that's prescribed on the health certificate, you shouldn't get the health certificate signed, and basically it's invalid. But for some reason they got up to the port and they determined that you ran the wrong test, that animal won't cross, and it'll either be returned or sent back for more testing in the state it's in now. Some countries require an import permit to export. Some states require an import permit, so you need to check. If you don't have the import permit, you won't get into the country or state of destination either. User fee, there's a payment that's due with international movements in our office when you send the health certificate. Okay, next slide. Here's a few things that you don't want to do. That they'll get you in trouble, and we'll go back to our code of conduct and our potential penalty phase that against accredited veterinarians. And sorry to say, these are things that have been done, and these are things that people have paid the price for. But you don't want to issue pre-signed certificates. Certainly don't want to, leave a cell barn with a bunch of certificates with your signature on it and allow somebody else to enter the data that on where that animal's or shipment may be going. You don't want to do it at a bull sale or anything. You just don't want to pre-sign those certificates. You don't want to issue certificates without looking at the animals. You'll be pressured to, do this. You may have a client that says, well, you're just out of my place 2 weeks ago and you saw that animal. Well, if you weren't there to specifically, examine that animal, you need to get them in and look at them. Splitting blood samples, this is just, a big no-no, and that'll usually get your accreditation revoked, and you won't be doing any accredited work for some time if you do that. And that, what I'm talking about there is, pulling one blood sample and pulling it off and, saying it came from 5 or 6 different animals. Just don't even think about that. And then, of course, any health certificate or certificate of veterinary inspection that requires an animal to be tested, it requires that the testing to be complete and negative. So we can't ship animals saying, well, the testing will be done, in a couple days and everything's going to be fine. It's got to be done negative and reported out before, the health certificate should be signed or should be presented to the federal office for endorsement. These are all illegal and they all get you in trouble and basically ruin your reputation. So, just really think about that. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just a sample of the EIA test chart for, Coggins testing or ELISA testing. This particular form that I'm showing is an outdated form. It's down here at the bottom. It says VS Form 1011, May 2003. The form you should be using is a 2019 form. So we want to make sure, we're using the right forms. We want to make sure we've got something in every block on this form that is for the veterinarian's use. The bottom section's for the lab use, and the session numbers for the lab to put in, but everything else should have something written in it, either not applicable, none, or the proper descriptive. These all have your signature on them. These are all, subject to review, subject to interpretation, and, subject to penalty. And, you may have to go out and re-bleed a horse just because you didn't do this form quite right. Just take your time. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think there's a couple slides here about importation of animals. Accredited vets aren't generally involved in this that much. Your involvement is probably going to be centered around as a source of information for your clients. They may be asking about importing a certain breed of bird or a horse or something like that. But typically, all livestock imported in the United States typically requires a quarantine. The exception would be, I think, cattle and horses from Canada, and they are inspected, but they aren't quarantined. But I think cattle from Mexico are inspected at the border, but horses from any other country are placed in quarantine, and they have a battery of tests that they have to pass before they're released. Zoo animals, typically the same way. So, like I said, you're basically a source of information, and your best advice, or my best advice to you is, if you get these questions, you can kind of forward them on to the state or the federal counterparts. federal government has requirements for importing animals, but the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of states, if you want to go to the next slide, Brad, a lot of states have requirements that are even more restrictive than the nation does. So, you know, while I can give you import regulations for cattle from Canada to the United States, North Dakota, South Dakota, Indiana, they may have additional requirements, and depending where you're working, you're going to probably want to check with that state official and just determine if there's any additional requirements. Okay, well, I think that ends my sections. We can go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Brad Christensen. And thanks again, and best of luck to all of you. Sorry if we're still having problems with the program. All right, Brad.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name's Brad. I'm the one you've been emailing when you couldn't get on. I apologize for the technical issues. I will get a copy of all of this out to you guys via email in the next few days, so you'll have at least something for reference. We'll also be doing this again on next week on the 22nd, so you're welcome to at least join the first section of that if you want to jump on the portion that you missed if you couldn't get on the webinar. We were also going to try to give you a little short break between my two sections and Dr. Ryder's, but I think we may just forego that little short break to respect your time. It looks like we're going to probably go over our 90 minutes that I'd scheduled, but that's okay. Please stick with us. We'll try to get through as soon as we can. So my first section is on our animal disease programs. I will be probably just hitting mostly highlights on a lot of these slides. Normally this is a hour-and-a-half section that we're trying to squeeze into 30 minutes. So just to remind you, I'll have all the reference materials and websites and stuff sent out so you can dig a little deeper if you need to. But so to get started, we have a lot of different disease programs in the USDA, some eradication programs like tuberculosis. We do a lot of monitoring and surveillance. We have certification and control programs like certified herd programs. Some of the things that you'll have responsibilities for with this type of program work, you need to know your basic program requirements. Each of our specific disease programs have a set of guidance and protocols. I don't expect you to memorize them. They're not that strict and lengthy, but again, those will be available to you in some of our reference slides. But as an accredited vet, whatever you're starting to do, if you're working with TB or brucellosis, just get familiar with the program before you get started doing a lot of that work. Another thing is to begin to get familiar with official animal ID. That's a concept that we talk a lot about in the work we do. Official ID I'll talk about in the next section, but it plays a major part in the disease programs we have. And lastly here, get to know your state and your country requirements. Rick already mentioned this, especially for animal movement. There's a lot of things to remember. We, again, don't expect you to memorize these things. If you walked away from my section with one piece of advice, it would be to, as soon as you start practicing, get to know your area VMO, put their phone number in your phone and save it. That's what we're here for. We don't want you to have to memorize all this, but at least know where to go to find the information. So in the stuff you've heard already in these disease programs, get that contact in there. They're a great portal for you to get all this information. This is an example of something that you'll be expected to become familiar with. Every state has a reportable diseases list, and this is an example from the Kansas KDA website. You can Google this and find it. Every state's going to have a reportable diseases list. They're fairly similar across most states in the country. There are some unique differences, but generally they're pretty close. There are some reportable diseases that you are required to report to the state that you don't necessarily have to report to a federal veterinarian. For example, trichomoniasis in Kansas, that's a state disease program that you are required as a licensed vet within this state to report anytime you have a detection. Typically, if you contact your VMO or the state vet or the state AVIC for the USDA, one will contact the rest. So as long as you contact one, all of us will find out. We have 3 main eradication programs going on in the country right now. I'll touch some highlights on each of them: tuberculosis, brucellosis, and scrapie. Tuberculosis is probably one of our biggest disease programs in the country and the one that has the most involvement with accredited veterinarians. Our bread and butter test for TB is called a caudal fold test, the skin test, and the vast majority are done by accredited veterinarians. This is a relatively simple test. It's an intradermal injection of 0.1 milliliters of tuberculin into the tail fold of a cow. You inject, you come back in 72 hours, plus or minus 6, and you're looking for any type of a reaction. And you might ask, what's a response? Well, any type of swelling, redness, a lump, a bump, even skin thickening, that's considered a response, and we consider that a suspect. So when you find something like that, you call it a suspect, you contact your area VMO, and they're going to come out and do a follow-up test. It's also important here to note that if you inject, you also have to be the one to read. That is a requirement as part of the standards that you have to be both injecting and reading the vet when doing this test. You have to report this pretty quickly because we have a time window that we have to fall within. Our regulatory VMO is going to follow up with another skin test. It's a little more specific, called a comparative cervical test that's done over the neck of the cow. But this has to be done within 10 days. If we miss that window, it becomes an invalid test, and it'll have to be repeated. But due to the nature of how this test works with the immune system, we'll have to wait 60 days. In the meantime, this cow and all the cows in that group are under quarantine and can cause some huge problems, particularly because most of these tests are being done for animals that are getting ready to move to another state. Also, if you are doing enough tests, you're going to see some suspects. We expect 1 to 5% false positives. The vast majority, again, of our caudal fold tests are negative, but we know after doing hundreds of thousands of these tests, there's going to be about 1 to 5% are false positives, and that is okay. We expect it. Things like Johne's disease can cause a cross-reaction or a lump, even just some edema from the injection site. If you do more than 300 tests per year, we're going to expect that you'll be reporting some suspects. If you do not, or you're not at the rate we expect, we'll probably reach out to you just to make sure everything's being done correctly, make sure you have current or some antigen that hasn't been out of date or expired. Sometimes we'll go out and help with technique just to make sure. It's not a difficult test to learn, but it does take a little practice to become proficient. So when you get established, find a vet in your practice that's good at this and have them train you. If you don't have that option, reach out to your VMO, and they will help find that opportunity for you, or they can do it themselves. We also have a TB program in deer and elk, and there are a few differences from our cattle program. Number one being you do have to have some additional training to do TB testing in deer and elk. On that second line, you'll see a designated accredited veterinarian. It's not a lot of extra training, but we do have to have a regulatory veterinarian oversee you doing this test just to make sure everything's being done correctly. Then you're qualified to be able to do this testing. A second difference is that there are 2 types of TB tests that we do in deer and elk. The first one is a skin test called a single cervical test. It's similar to the caudal fold test. It's just done on the skin over the neck of the deer. And you come back same time. You come back 72 hours, plus or minus 6, looks for a reaction. accredited vet, or sorry, regulatory vet will follow up with a CCT if you find a reaction. We also have a longer window. If we miss that test or it's invalid, we have to wait 90 days, so that's even worse if we miss that window. The second test is a blood test, serum test called a dual path platform. It's basically serology. This is being done a lot more commonly these days for our herd testing in deer and elk. The main reason being a lot of these deer and elk have to be tranquilized to have diagnostics done. With a blood test, it's a one-time. With a skin test, it's 2 times minimum, potentially darting down. And some of these animals will die just from the tranquilizer alone. So just know there are those 2 options. We also do TB testing in other species. I'm not going to go into those because they're not done very often, but we have reference documents to help out with those if you have that situation. But again, usually your field VMO in your area can help you out with that. Sorry. Just some general TB testing tips to remember. You can get all that tuberculin and reporting forms and official forms. Those are free of charge. You just contact your area USDA office, or you can contact the state vet and they can direct you to the correct location. We'll send all that stuff out to you. That's part of doing your job. It is a little bit of a sensitive antigen, so we don't want to expose it to light, air, really cold or really hot. It will lose its potency. You don't want to store it in syringes. It's very tempting, but do not do that. That will affect the potency as well. If you finish testing and you still have a partial vial left, just go ahead and get rid of it. Throw it away, call us, we'll get you a new vial. I know what it's like. Vets just want to suck every last drop of medication out of a vial before they throw it away. But in this case, just chuck it. It will probably lose its potency by the next time you use it. There are no withdrawal periods with tuberculin. We do ask that you don't test cattle that are sick and you don't treat cattle while you are testing them. Both of those can have a negative effect on the test. Brucellosis is another disease program, and I forgot to mention all 50 states are considered free of tuberculosis. They are also all 50 states are considered free of brucellosis. However, we do have a unique area around Yellowstone National Park that has a different regulatory authority around it because we have an endemic problem with brucellosis in elk and bison in Yellowstone, and it will spill over into cattle in the greater Yellowstone area. If you work in that area, you will have to become familiar with those specific requirements. There are some additional testing and surveillance requirements. But in general, across the country, we've basically eradicated this disease from our commercial cattle populations across the country. What you might be involved with is vaccination. Brucellosis vaccination is very effective, and it's still done on a pretty common basis. It is a few points to make about this vaccination. Brucellosis is zoonotic. We can have an iatrogenic disease caused by accidental needle pokes, so you got to be really careful with this. We only vaccinate female cattle 4 to 12 months of age. You can also vaccinate female bison, but this is a female only, and it's under a year old. That's kind of the point to remember there. There's a couple other steps with this. Number one, they have to have an official ID. Usually they're going to get an orange metal tag called an OCV tag or official capsid vaccination tag, or an orange RFID tag I'll talk more about. That orange is a visual identifier for brucellosis vaccination. If they already have official ID, you do not have to add that, but they do have to have some type of official ID when they get vaccinated. And the last step is a tattoo. All cattle are going to get this tattoo in the right ear. It's a 3-section tattoo. So you're going to have the first part is an R for it designates RB51 vaccine. The middle section is going to have a V shield. This is an official shield to show that it is an official vaccinate, and we will provide that. And the last part is the last digit of the year you vaccinated. So, for example, this year you would have an R, a V, and that stands for an RB51 official vaccinate 2020. So the official ID, the vaccine, and the tattoo are all required. And pretty much any kind of official work you're doing is going to be reported. So this is no different. Vaccinating, you're going to be reporting this on an official vaccine form. If you do any testing as well, same. These forms need to have the official ID written on them and well filled out and reported to our offices. So you submit those. We need those. They're very important for our traceability of these animals. So if anything ever happens, a disease cropped up, we use these forms and this official ID to help us determine where these animals have been. The next two diseases are of swine, swine brucellosis and pseudorabies. Very, very similar programs. Just like tuberculosis in cattle and brucellosis in cattle, all 50 states are considered free, accredited free for swine brucellosis and swine pseudorabies. These are completely different diseases, but the eradication programs are very similar. This has been eradicated out of our commercial herds, but we do have problems with these in our feral swine populations, which are pretty extensive across the United States. We'll sometimes have spillover from feral swine into backyard swine once in a while, particularly in our southern states. So these are times if you're working with backyard pigs, these are things we want you to be aware of because we want you to recognize if you're seeing disease symptoms or problems. But you also may be doing some blood testing for herd certifications or herd movements, show pigs, for example. The pseudorabies, again, they're two different diseases, but the programs are almost identical. If you are testing for one disease, typically you just test for both. Any kind of movement restrictions usually require testing of both. So again, both of these diseases are more of a concern because of our feral swine population in the country. For example, even here in Kansas, we've detected pseudorabies in feral pigs just in the last few months. So it's something we always watch out for. We do a lot of surveillance for. The last one here is scrapie. This is our only disease eradication program in sheep and goats. Scrapie is a prion disease. It's a fatal neurologic disease caused by the prion protein. It's very similar to mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans, and chronic wasting disease in elk. It is not zoonotic. This is just a sheep and goat problem. It has a very high, I guess what I should say here is one unique thing about it is it has a strong genetic component. We can test sheep to be able to determine by their genotypes which ones are susceptible and which ones aren't. So we have the advantage of being able to breed away from this disease. And our program over the past 20 years has been very effective of eliminating this disease from our country. We still are on the watch for any kind of neurologic sheep, and we want you to be able to recognize and report those. As far as your role in testing, might be limited. If you have any type of scrapie flocks that are doing certification programs, you may be asked to collect some sampling. We don't have a blood test for this disease. We can only diagnose this from basically brain tissue on dead animals. So we're looking for brainstem and lymph nodes from our dead animals to diagnose it. That is something that you can do and you may potentially be asked to do as an accredited veterinarian. We do some live animal testing, but this is a rectal biopsy, and it's only done by regulatory veterinarians. It makes up a very tiny fraction of our overall testing for this disease. And lastly, you could be asked to do some genetic testing, pulling some blood for these genotypes. It's an official test, but it can be used for management purposes, but also as part of our eradication program. There are a few lesser-known surveillance programs you could become involved with, depending on where you're located or what niche you get in private practice. There's some aquaculture programs with infectious salmon anemia. Screwworm is a maggot that can feed on live tissue. We eradicated it from the U.S. and Central America and have got it pinned back down as far as Panama for many years now, but we still worry about it coming into our country. We had a little outbreak in the Florida Keys just a couple of years ago. So it's something to be aware of and watch for, especially if you're having animals move in from other countries. We do see this in pets sometimes, and it can affect people. A little unique program along the southern border with Texas and Mexico called cattle fever tick. Tick fever is a disease caused by babesiosis in cattle, and it's transmitted by a vector, a specific species of tick. There's been a program in place for many years to control this tick, and it's been pushed back to the border with Mexico. We have a buffer zone there, or there's a strong prevention program and eradication program. So if you live in that South Texas area, this is something you'll become familiar with. If not, you may never hear of it again. Swine fever, African and classical, we don't have in our country, but we take great caution to make sure it doesn't enter our country. You won't be probably necessarily doing any type of testing or surveillance for this, but we want you to recognize symptoms and signs. Dr. Ryder will probably mention some of this. So this is something we want you to be aware of and be able to report to us. And lastly, chronic wasting disease. This is our prion disease of elk and deer. Just like scrapie, it's a fatal neurologic disease. We have it both in domestic and wild cervids across our country. If you're in a state that allows domestic cervids and they're going to be moving elk or deer across state lines, they have to be part of the CWD program. And a big piece of that is surveillance testing. They have to test all their animals that die in those herds to make sure they don't have CWD. So you may be asked to pull brainstem and lymph node tissue on those animals. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move into section 4. This is a bit of a catch-all section. We're going to talk about animal traceability, disease traceability, and some laboratory support. When we talk about disease traceability, it's a common term we use, but it's something you may not hear a lot in private practice, but it's our ability to detect and respond and trace disease. And there's really two main pillars of our animal disease traceability: official identification and movement documentation. In general, if you're going to be moving livestock from one state to another, you're going to have official ID and official movement documentation. And there are exceptions, but I'm not going to go into that. That's just the general rule of thumb. Official ID can vary by species. Typically, we are most commonly talking about cattle or sheep and goats when we're talking about official ID. In cattle, after March 11th of 2015 is when this program really came into effect, where we're requiring official ID, who gets official ID, and what type. I'll show some examples here in a minute. There are some exceptions. Brands and tattoos can be considered official ID as long as receiving states are willing to accept that, but not used very commonly. What makes something an official U.S. ID is that it has a unique individual official ID number, and it has this U.S. shield you'll see on that slide there. It's imprinted on every official U.S. ID. So if you see one and you're not sure, that's what you're looking for, is that shield. We maintain databases with all the information about where tags have been distributed. That way we can track where those have been sent. So we'll maybe send you a batch of 1,000 tags, and we know those went to you, and it's your responsibility to keep track of what animals those tags have been put in. That's how we track and trace animal movement. We don't make these tags. We actually use private manufacturers, but they are licensed to use these or to create these tags for us. These are just some examples. There's a variety of different tags. Sometimes it's a little overwhelming to try to figure out. We would like to eventually get to a single type of tag. We would also like to get to electronic tags if possible, but up above you'll see two common types of metal tags. On the left, the orange one is a brucellosis vaccination tag, and the top one we often call a silver bright, but you can see the U.S. shield on there. The one on the middle left, that's a RFID or radio frequency ID tag, called an 840 tag. This is an 840 is the prefix that is official for the U.S. 15 digits. That just happens to be orange because it's a brucellosis tag, but we also have white ones that look just exactly the same. So again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but look for the U.S. shield, and just know that animals that are going to be moving across state lines are probably going to need to have this in their ear. The other pillar, again, is the movement documentation when it comes to traceability. Every animal in general should be on a certificate of veterinary inspection. There are different forms. There are hard copy, like our old-fashioned certificate books where you have carbon copies. If you use those, you got to make sure that all the copies are legible, that they're being distributed to the right people in a timely manner. It does us no good to get a copy of a health certificate that is 3 months old. We just lose our traceability and the purpose for it. The real push these days is towards electronic CDI, and most states will have a version or a type. Kansas has a great one, for example, is one of the leaders in the country for using electronic CDI documentation, and it's much, much more efficient. It's less labor intensive and less room for error. So the general trend is moving towards electronic health certificates. Just keep that in mind as you go out into practice. I'd encourage you to embrace any kind of these technological capacities with CDIs and IDs and so forth, because it just improves your value as a veterinarian. There's a lot of vets that are resistant to moving over to this because they're just used to the old standard, but the trend is pushing this direction. And Rick mentioned this earlier. Basically, as an accredited vet, you are working on behalf of the federal government. We're going to give you certain types of property, things like official health certificates and so forth. Just remember that you are accountable for that. Don't be tempted to cut corners or do favors and hand out little books of health certificates. This all comes back to you, and it's on your license. So don't be tempted early on to make exceptions or cut corners. Blood sampling. For official testing of any type, there's a lot of options. There are a lot of commercial laboratories that are able to perform this. You may be required to be an accredited veterinarian to pull samples, but state labs, commercial labs, I will provide a list in our reference documents where you can look up these laboratories. Occasionally, you may be asked to send these directly to our national laboratory, and there's a specific protocol for it. There's a specific submission form and way of doing this. Again, if you get to the situation, just give your VMO a call, and they can walk you through this process. Actually, that's the end of my section. I appreciate your time. Again, I'm going to make sure all of you get a copy of these slides and reference websites and reference slides. So I know we're glossing over this kind of quickly, and we're going to skip the short break, and I'm going to go ahead and move over to Dr. Dan Ryder to start presenting his portion of the presentation, and then we'll finish up if you have any questions after that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brad, and hello, everybody. So I think we can get through these next two sections fairly quickly. I'll definitely be focusing on the takeaways here. So with that said, let's get going. Okay, so as far as reportable diseases, we want to make you aware of this, and I'm sure you are aware of this, but just to review, there are 2 or 3 different categories you could lump these reportable diseases into. There's the big one, which is foreign animal diseases, which you hear synonymously with transboundary diseases, so don't get thrown off by that. Transboundary is used in place of foreign animal diseases terminology, say, in Europe and overseas, whereas in the U.S. we refer to them as foreign animal diseases. So obviously if you come across or are suspicious of a foreign animal disease, that would be reportable. Then we have another group, which is the program diseases, and those are what Dr. Christensen just went over. They're diseases that we control. We have programs in place to control and attempt in some cases to eradicate them, but due to various different reasons, we have not been able to eradicate them. So they're lumped under these program diseases. And that would be, for instance, tuberculosis, where we see it, say, in the wildlife, and brucellosis or pseudorabies. Those diseases, if those are identified in livestock species that you come across, that would also be reportable. And then the third bucket, these are diseases that don't fall under the other two groups that the state where you practice require you to report those. So depending on where you end up, make sure you get the diseases within your state that you are required to report. and I'll show you a quick slide or two on how you can easily get those lists of diseases quickly just by using Google. Now, with the reportable diseases and foreign animal diseases, you're required to notify the USDA Veterinary Services, and the way you would do that is to report that to the area veterinarian in charge. So Dr. Tanner, who presented the first two sections, if you were practicing in the state of Kansas, you would notify him, and I'll show you how you can get those numbers. You could also notify your field veterinarian that you will hopefully get in contact with, depending on where you end up, depending on which state. Make that connection with your field veterinarian. And so any of these issues that come up where you're questioning how to handle it, or even reporting a disease, you can make that communication directly through your field veterinarian. And also, it is, though it seems maybe redundant to have to do this, but you are required to also notify the state animal health official. So that would be like the state veterinarian, for instance, within the state that you practice. Technically, you're required to notify both the state and the USDA. Like Dr. Christensen had said, oftentimes across the board there's solid communication between the state and USDA, and so notifying one will result in the other being notified. But if that hasn't been specified when you report the disease, make sure you follow up and report either the state or the federal. And while we're on this slide, I just wanted to point out, just as the more you see it, the better. So virulent Newcastle disease, which we have an outbreak that we're hoping to have successfully eradicated. We're almost 2 years into it now down in Southern California. Here's clinical signs of what that looks like, and this is a rooster in Southern California that we took a picture of during the outbreak, and here I'll point out you have swollen eyes with conjunctivitis. You have bluing of the comb, so a cyanotic bluing of that comb. And another thing that is a little bit tricky to make out due to the background of the dirt, but around that beak there's exudate that is coating that from a respiratory infection that's associated with this virus. And so if you see especially a game fowl, and you're a small animal practitioner, or could be non-game fowl, could just be any backyard poultry, and you see increased morbidity or mortality, see these respiratory lesions, don't forget to have a virulent Newcastle disease on your differential. And similarly, there's some overlap with avian influenza, so keep that on your radar. Even if you're thinking that you won't be practicing with livestock or poultry, this outbreak that we're currently battling down there in Southern California was initiated by a small animal practitioner that got the ball rolling with identifying that. Now, to the right of that picture, we have an ear of a pig, and this is a pig that has African swine fever. Now, that is a hot topic right now with respect to the pork industry and the concern with this expansion and spread throughout China. It's made a devastating impact there in China and areas outside of China and as the surrounding countries and even into Eastern European countries, but it's been absolutely devastating to the Chinese pork industry, where they've lost estimates, depending on where you fall with how accurate the numbers are that they're reporting. However, they've lost upwards to 50 to 75% of their hogs due to this virus. So African swine fever, we want to keep that on our radar. So if you have potbelly pigs, if you're a small animal practitioner, you want to keep that on your radar. And so this image here shows the clinical signs that you can see with that, and it's where you'll see this discoloration of the skin and hemorrhage or petechiation that you can see. They describe it as being on the ear tips, but also throughout various regions of the body, so not just localized to the ear tips. But again, with both, any foreign animal disease for that matter, an increase in morbidity, and coupled with some of these classic lesions, you want to keep foreign animal diseases on your radar. And then finally, down here on the bottom right, these are ulcerations within the oral cavity of a cow with foot-and-mouth disease. Okay, so you're out in practice. You want to get the list of diseases. Just a quick demonstration. Google USDA reportable diseases or any combination of words that would make sense, and you'll get this page here, this APHIS Veterinary Services page that is actually, if you're familiar with the Veterinary Accreditation program page, you can get there as well through that page, but it'll bring you to this where it has at the top there, notifiable diseases and conditions. And from there, it'll tell you the, based on the species, which diseases are reportable. And then the program diseases that Dr. Christensen went over. Okay, so characteristics of foreign animal diseases. So people, I would say across the board, we're all kind of familiar with vesicular lesions being something that should raise a red flag. So for foot-and-mouth disease, if you're seeing vesicular lesions or vesicular stomatitis of the feet and, say, teats and oral cavity, you definitely want to keep that on your radar for obvious reasons. But also, if you look at the image here on the left, this is a cow with lumpy skin disease, so these pox, viral lumpy skin type lesions in livestock, in sheep or cattle. That's a foreign animal disease. The image down here below that, where you can see the screwworm flies and these masses of eggs that were deposited within this wound, and then deep in that wound, you'll have the fly larva. So all three stages within that wound. This is something to keep on your radar. So small animal practitioner that is not, unlikely to see, say, something like foot and mouth disease. This is something that can be presented in cats and dogs. And then also in this picture, we have this is demonstrating, increased morbidity. So, for instance, in pigs, this is a group of pigs that have been inoculated with African swine fever. You can see they're huddling, they're febrile. On the bottom right, we have bloody diarrhea. You can see this purple hemorrhagic discoloration of the skin. So a characteristic that this is representing is this high morbidity demonstrated in livestock species. So a lumpy, just to recap on these images, myiasis, where you have larvae in the wounds, keep on your differential that could be screwworm, lumpy skin type lesions in livestock, and then increased morbidity and septicemic type clinical signs in pigs or any livestock for that matter. Something else to keep in mind that's very obvious, I would say, in common sense standpoint, but don't forget to keep in mind when you're doing your history is determining whether or not there's a history of foreign travel of either workers or family members, visitors that could have potentially brought something in, mail from overseas, gifts, that sort of thing. Animals that were imported or embryos or semen. We'll keep going here. Okay, so just as a reminder and to hear this so that you keep this in mind, it's easy to, and it makes sense to not be focusing on zebras, but do not forget that the foreign animal diseases are out there, and it's something that, for instance, we do see more common than I know I was aware of. It does happen, and you don't want to be the person that overlooked and did not tip off USDA and the state to allow us to get on top of one of these foreign animal diseases because of the severe impact that it can have on not only from the trade and economic standpoint from our nation, but also the workers and the families and communities that rely on these various different food commodities that would be impacted by a foreign animal disease being introduced. So again, if you suspect it, please call the area veterinarian in charge or the field veterinarian that works for the state or federal government, and make sure that if the communication hasn't taken place to let you know that, hey, we'll take it from here, and let the state know or the federal government know or vice versa. Make sure that you follow up and let both the state and USDA know what's going on and what you're seeing. Okay, so how do you get the contact information to notify the area veterinarian in charge with the USDA and the state veterinarian? So you can, I just plugged in for demonstration purposes USDA veterinary services. It'll bring you to this page here that you can click on. And on this page that comes up, it gives you a 24-hour hotline that you can call if you don't already have the numbers of people within your state. But then it also has links to not only the area veterinarian in charge with USDA, but also the state veterinarian. So if you're in Kansas, just for demonstration purposes, I clicked on those links, scroll down to Kansas. It gives you the contact information there that you can see for Dr. Smith, the state veterinarian, and then the area veterinarian in charge, Dr. Tanner. Okay, so when you call a foreign animal disease diagnostician will come out, which is basically just a state or federal veterinarian that's had some additional training in foreign animal diseases and has seen those demonstrated either in the field or also in the lab. They'll come out and do the full workup and keep you informed every step of the way and handle everything from that standpoint. Okay, so instead of going through each of these, I have 3 cases to look at. I'll just review some of the clinical signs here and talk a little bit about these 3 different diseases. So the first, this is one where foot and mouth disease is on your differential. So you have these ulcerations and erosions within the nasal cavity. You have this excessive drooling, which is a common finding with foot and mouth disease. They describe lip smacking and excessive drool. So if you saw that or this was reported, keep that on your rule out for foot and mouth disease. Some additional images here of the image to the left where we have some fresh vesicles, and then right here, caudal to the teeth on the gingiva, you can see an ulceration. So images of foot and mouth. Here's some lesions from cattle in Uganda from a month ago, where you can see these ulcerations in the oral cavity and on the tongue. With foot and mouth disease in cattle, you see these ulcerations between the claws, so in the interdigital cleft. So most likely, you know, you would think this is maybe just foot rot if you just saw these lesions in the feet and it wasn't super apparent looking at the oral cavity, but if you have multiple animals and some other clinical signs that jump out or just doesn't seem right, make sure you let us know. And some differentials here. So with the oral cavity lesions can range from some endemic infectious diseases here in the U.S. to non-infectious causes to something that would be devastating. So, for instance, in the United Kingdom, here's what a outbreak resulted in, with over 2,000 farms being infected and 10 million animals having to be depopped. So here's a case of screwworm. So over the years, this is not something that's that uncommon for us to have reported. So animals being brought in that were overseas with their owner from an area that screwworm is endemic, bringing that pet over or importing that pet or livestock and identifying these screwworm larvae. So the thing that you'll be faced with to sort out will be, is this fly strike and what's might be termed blowfly myiasis? So is this just flies that we have within the U.S. that have laid their eggs and larvae developed on dead tissue, or is this something where this is a screwworm larva? And so, some features of screwworm larvae, they have these 3 linear stripes on their back in this bluish to green metallic appearance with these orange eyes. Now, being out and practicing, you may not remember this slide that clearly, so, and it's not worth trying to be a parasitologist, so you might as well just go ahead and collect those larvae and send them in. Again, here's an image of what the screwworm eggs look like, and they describe it as forming, shingle-like pattern of an arrangement within the wind. So here are some examples of what we've seen recently. So somebody had some larvae on a sore in their scalp in Alabama in '98, a cat in Florida from Guantanamo Bay, a gelding in Florida again that had larvae in the prepuce, a dog in Florida and Mississippi, and then the most recent and most noteworthy is a 2016 infestation in the Florida Keys, where these big pine key deer from this key deer refuge that got infested with screwworm, and it was 30 years. It was the first local infestation in the U.S. in more than 30 years, and the first infestation in Florida because they were identified in the mainland on Florida, first time in 50 years. So we eradicated this with that sterile fly technique, and that was fairly recent, so from 2015 to 2016. Estimated costs today, it would be $750 million a year if we did get this screwworm reintroduced into the U.S. Okay, and then finally, Newcastle disease, to keep this on your radar. The clinical signs associated with this predominantly in Southern California were respiratory, increased morbidity and mortality, and lethargy and that sort of thing. There was presentation of the neurologic form, but by far it was more of a respiratory presentation with an increased morbidity, mortality, often associated with game fowl. Here's a picture of one of the first roosters here that was identified, depressed, mucus coming out of the beak, that cyanotic comb, diarrhea here on the top of this bucket. That's also a clinical finding. Here are the classic lesions that are described for Newcastle, but there is overlap in these lesions. They're not pathognomonic. So within the oral cavity, you'll see these fibrinotic, necrotic, and hemorrhagic areas. You can see within the trachea as well. You can see how this would look similar to infectious laryngotracheitis in poultry. Here within the trachea, here's some hemorrhage. The proventriculus, you have hemorrhagic areas within the mucosa. And then another classic finding are these necrotic areas within the cecal tonsils. So differentials for that, it could range from something that's run-of-the-mill within the U.S. to even avian influenza or Newcastle. So don't forget to keep that on your radar. Big impact, so there was a huge outbreak in 2002, 2003. We're currently hoping to get out of the current one, which is started in May of 2018, so we're coming up on 2 years. But just the most recent outbreak, you can see that quite a few animals, quite a few birds had to get depopulated. Okay, so just in summary, even if it's unlikely, but there's just something about the case that you're looking at or the farm that you're visiting that could be a foreign animal disease. Odds are that it's not. Don't let that hold you back from letting us know. We'd rather you let us know. It helps for our just overall surveillance, for demonstrating to our trading partners, and we'd rather be we're expecting it to not be a foreign animal disease, and we'd rather be notified and be out and take a look than to not be informed. So don't hesitate to let us know if you're ever thinking that something could be a foreign animal disease, or even if it's low on your rule out list. Don't hesitate to let us know. And after all, I mean, if you think about what we're looking at currently, there are 4 different foreign animal disease outbreaks that the U.S. is responding to right now. So we have the high-path avian influenza on the East Coast. We have rabbit hemorrhagic disease in the Southwest. We have Newcastle in Southern California. And we also have vesicular stomatitis that has reared its head again already this year. So you may not hear about foreign animal disease, you may not think that it's likely, but the fact of the matter is it's potentially more frequent than you'd think. And please don't hold back and make sure you inform us. And with that, I think we'll open it up for questions. Here are some slides that have, or some links that will be provided to you that have to do with the material that we presented today. And I'll stop there.
All right. At this time, we still have not seen any questions, but if you do want to ask any question, please press #2 or #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, and at that time, you can state your name and your question. To submit a question using the chat, select all panelists from the drop-down menu, enter your question in the message box provided, and send.
This is Brad. I'm just going to jump in real quick, too. I know it's gone pretty late for you guys. If you also have a question after we're done tonight, I'll put my email up on that screen right there. You are welcome to shoot any of us, but particularly me. You can send an email with any questions. Like Dr. Ryder said, we'll be sending out this information over email to you as well.
Brad, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Dr. Tanner, and I want to thank everybody again for attending. You will also be getting a form in the email that is a statement of attendance that will need to be returned to our office as well. So be looking for that as well. But we'll have to have that in your accreditation file. So just be looking for that.
All right, looks like at this time there's still no questions in the queue.
Okay, well, I think once again, I just thank Brad and Dan for helping out, and best of luck to all the new graduates. I know you're looking forward to getting out there and getting to work, and hopefully this crazy COVID thing will be put to rest soon, and we can all go on with our lives as normal. But by all means, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us by telephone or shoot us an email. Other than that, I think we're good to conclude the webinar.
All right, well, that concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.